Good afternoon and good morning to those of us on the West Coast, and happy Valentine's Day. My name is Tammy Seaver, and I'm the Program Manager for the State of Nevada's Elder Protective Service Program. I'm a Western Regional Representative, also a member of the National Adult Protective Services Association. I also serve as Chair for the Regional Representative Advisory Board. Thank you for joining us for Investigating Financial Exploitation, New York's FEIST-y New Approach webinar. Please type your questions in the message board and we will try to answer as many as possible near the end of the presentation. I will briefly introduce our speakers so we can begin learning more about this exciting new tool to assist APS and its partners in the investigation of vulnerable adults. Alan Lawitz has served as the Director of the Bureau of Adult Services of New York State Office of Children and Family Services since November 2007. He was previously an Associate Attorney for the New York State Department of Health, as well as Senior Attorney for the New York State Department of Social Services, working primarily on legal issues related to APS, long-term care, and homeless housing. Alan is a Northeast 2 Regional Representative and a member of the National Adult Protective Services Association. He was the recipient of the 2016 President's Award presented by NAPSA for his contributions to the field of APS and NAPSA. He earned his bachelor's degree from Columbia University and his law degree from Syracuse University College of Law. Karen Weber is a forensic accountant, certified public accountant, and certified fraud examiner in Rochester, New York. She has worked on financial cases for older and vulnerable adults for the last 10 years. Ms. Weber earned her bachelor's degree in accounting and her master's in forensic accounting from the College at Rockport State University of New York. Please note this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the NAPSA website in the next few weeks. The PowerPoint presentation used today will also be available on the NAPSA website. I will now turn the webinar over to Alan Lawitz, our first presenter today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy, and hello, everyone. It's great to be with you today as we introduce a new tool to help APS and its investigatory partners in the investigation of referrals of financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. The tool is called the Financial Exploitation Investigation Suite of Tools, or FEIST. The FEIST is intended to provide a structure to assist APS with client interviews, caseworker observation of red flags, collection of financial and other records, leads, and formatting of financial information collected for further review by a forensic accountant. It's intended to assist APS in making referrals as well for possible civil and criminal legal proceedings. APS and pilot sites under our grant that I'll describe have also have access to a forensic accountant for consultation and referral for a forensic accountant report. I'll bypass the presenter information. You could look at that later if you're interested. I will discuss the grant OCFS received to develop and test the FEIST, and I'll provide a brief background on financial exploitation of vulnerable adults and what we were intending to do, we intended to enhance APS practice through use of the FEIST. Karen Weber will take us through the FEIST tool itself and will explain the role of a forensic accountant in reviewing APS financial exploitation cases. In 2015, the U.S. Administration for Community Living, ACL, which is part of the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, ACL issued the first ever request for grant proposals from states specifically for the purpose of enhancing APS practice. My state agency, the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, or OCFS, we applied for a grant. The grant was intended to develop, in consultation with a forensic accountant, a new investigatory tool to assist APS and its partners to conduct investigations of financial exploitation cases and to test the tool at pilot sites, and to provide APS and the pilot sites with access to a forensic accountant in appropriate cases to review and make reports to assist APS in referral, criminal, and more civil proceedings. Another grant activity was to develop and test new reportable data elements to better capture costs of financial exploitation and case outcomes. This webinar will be focusing on the first two bullets, and we're hoping to be able to discuss the new data elements part of the grant in a future webinar. Around the time that we applied for the grant in 2015, our Bureau of Adult Services was heavily into a research initiative that resulted in the New York State Cost of Financial Exploitation study. In this study, we sought baseline data as to the financial costs of financial exploitation in terms of amounts stolen from victims, amounts spent by agencies such as APS and others to investigate financial exploitation, as well as the cost of new and additional government benefits resulting from the impoverishment of victims. The study also looked at referrals to civil and criminal authorities, and case application to ACL was in many ways a follow-up and complement to this cost study. Why did we wish to develop a new improved tool to assist APS in handling financial exploitation cases? We saw an increasing number of cases of financial exploitation in New York State, including many complex cases. Financial exploitation was the #1 form of abuse by a perpetrator in most of New York State, and the number of cases of suspected financial exploitation has risen significantly across the state in recent years. There's been an increase in the number of APS financial exploitation referrals of over 40% since 2010 statewide. We wanted to provide APS with a better structure for organizing their investigation, the observation of red flags, collection of records, and financial records collected. We also recognize that the review of complex cases and voluminous financial records often requires the expertise of forensic accountants or certified fraud examiners. Do you remember the show Star Trek? Captain Kirk would often ask his medical officer and director, Dr. McCoy, to handle many challenging tasks. In one episode, Kirk orders McCoy to heal a silicone-based life form that looked like a blob of rock and lava. And if the procedure went wrong, there could be disastrous results. McCoy shouts back to Captain Kirk, "I'm a doctor, not a bricklayer." In other episodes, McCoy would say, "Jim, I'm a doctor, not a mechanic." Well, similarly, in some of these more complex cases of financial exploitation, where there may be multiple banking or investment accounts or real property transactions, or cases involving a lot of financial records over a long period of time, we've heard from APS workers, "I'm a social worker, not an accountant." So we were looking to develop a tool with a forensic accountant that would help guide social workers, APS staff, in gathering the pertinent financial records and the review of such records with the assistance of a forensic accountant. We were looking to develop a tool to help provide APS workers with some additional assurance that by using the tool, they will have covered the right areas of inquiry with suggested questions for the client and others, that they'll make observations in the critical areas, that they'll be able to look for the warning signs of financial exploitation, and that they'll be able to follow suggested steps to seek important financial records. We're also looking for a tool that will help APS to summarize what the financial records show and put them into a clear and straightforward format. And we combine this with access to a forensic accountant for consultations and reviews in the more complex cases, which makes it in turn easier to share the results of the investigation with others, for possible future referrals for civil or criminal proceedings. We also wanted a tool that would help lead the worker to a determination whether or not, based on the information gathered and the observations made, whether or not it appeared that financial exploitation had actually occurred. We wanted a tool also that would help APS feel more confident that they could rule out financial exploitation and close a case with a suspected financial exploitation referral, where the use of the tool led to a determination that there is no evidence of financial exploitation. All right. So here on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see the definition of financial exploitation used by APS in New York State. Financial exploitation is the improper use of an adult's funds, property, or resources by another individual, including but not limited to fraud, false pretenses, embezzlement, conspiracy, forgery, falsifying records, coerced property transfers, or denial of access to assets. All right. In recent years, there's been a significant increase in the number of financial exploitation referrals made to APS in New York State, both outside of New York City and within New York City. This slide lays out the increase in numbers both for seniors as well as for all ages, meaning from age 18 and older, outside of New York City. Outside of New York City, financial exploitation is the highest number of the perpetrator-related risks. And you can see in 2018, financial exploitation comprised over 40% of all the involved risks for clients age 60 and older. New York City. Here we see the New York City referrals for financial exploitation from 2011 to 2018. Again, this shows a big increase in reported cases, both for seniors and the all-age category. Even with the significant increase of cases of financial exploitation reported to APS, we need to note that, unfortunately, the vast majority of financial exploitation goes unreported. In Under the Radar, the New York State Elder Abuse Prevalence Study that was issued in 2011, funded by OCFS, but conducted by Lifespan of Greater Rochester, Weill Cornell Medical Center, and the New York City Department for the Aging, it was found that only 1 in 44 cases of financial exploitation are reported. Our New York State Cost of Financial Exploitation study, which was issued in 2016, found that the great majority of perpetrators of financial exploitation, 67% was found in our study, were family members. So who were the perpetrators? Often they're persons that the victim knows, in addition to family. I'm not going to go through this in depth because I'm talking to APS and you know this. These are just types of financial exploitation by a person that the client knows. Well, this will be on the PowerPoint. You'll have that for your reference if need be. And of course, there's also many perpetrators of financial exploitation by strangers. And this slide includes many of the types of financial exploitation that we see, and I'm sure are seen across the country, from telemarketing and phone scams, from sweepstake and lottery scams, and Medicare and insurance frauds as well. I mentioned the Cost of Financial Exploitation study before. That study found that 19% of the victims in verified financial exploitation cases were adults in the age range of age 18 to 59. So it's important to note that the investigative tool and the access to the forensic accountant in the cases that we were testing under the grant extend to the full age range of APS clients from age 18 and older, and not confined to cases involving seniors. All right. So this slide shows the process of the development of the FEIST. Our Bureau of Adult Services, we held initial meetings with Karen Weber a forensic accountant, our bureau and Karen Weber met with an advisory group and representatives of the pilot sites as well. A series of additional meetings and calls and emails were held between the bureau, Karen Weber, and the advisory group members. And I'll have a slide later following. You can see who was on the advisory group. Karen Weber developed the initial draft of the FEIST. We sent the draft to our advisory group and to our pilot sites representatives for their review and comment. We incorporated their comments and we revised the FEIST. And the first trainings of the pilot sites were used in April 2017. And this slide shows the membership of the ACL Grant Advisory Group. And you can see that this includes representation from state and local police, district attorney's offices, providers of services to vulnerable adults and vulnerable elderly persons. I think it's important to stress that the FEIST was not developed in a vacuum. The FEIST was built on a foundation of other resources that we in New York State had developed and trained APS on in the past. This included our New Worker Institute training and special topic trainings on investigation of financial exploitation, a guide that we had developed called Broken Trust, Financial Exploitation and Power of Attorney Abuse, a field guide for APS professionals. Our training has always focused on warning signs of financial exploitation in the client's home, warning signs based on the client's demeanor, looking at questionable financial transactions, suspicious relationships. We had, in recent years, we had developed state forms that were sent by, these were state forms that were part of a national protocol that Joe Snyder and NAPSA and others helped develop, and I was on the committee that helped develop that, forms that APS sends to financial institutions requesting customer information, customer records that will assist APS in the investigation of suspected financial exploitation as well. In New York, we have what's called the 15-day letter, which is a letter that in power of attorney cases where the agent is suspected of either being negligent or of financial abuse, APS can send a letter demanding an accounting of the POA document and all documentation, receipts, transactions that the agent has done on behalf of the principal. And then if the agent fails to provide that those materials within 15 days, APS has the authority to go to court, initiate a special proceeding to compel disclosure by the agent. So, and we have also held trainings. We've worked with our New York State Department of Financial Services and conducted trainings of financial professionals to help financial professionals recognize, prevent, and report suspected financial exploitation. So the FEIST, the use of the FEIST is built on the foundation of training that we have developed with APS in the past. It's also important to note that the FEIST supports existing APS practice. Engagement of clients and building of trust and rapport is essential. We understand that we would not necessarily expect that a caseworker will ask at the first time that the caseworker meets the client, that they will ask probing questions about the client's finances. The caseworker needs to build up a relationship of trust. While we would certainly expect the caseworker to be making observations during the first visit, we certainly recognize that it may take multiple visits to get the answers needed to complete the areas of the FEIST. Another important thing to recognize, and for you to keep in mind as Karen walks us through the elements of the FEIST, is that the FEIST is intended to be a helpful structure, but it's not meant to be rigidly applied. We want the APS caseworker to take from the FEIST what will be helpful in the case presented. We do not expect that the entire FEIST will necessarily be used in every case. We want caseworkers to use enough of the FEIST steps to help them make a determination whether or not financial exploitation is occurring. We encourage APS to customize its use of the FEIST to meet the needs of the case. And as you will see when Karen walks us through the FEIST, there are places where the caseworker is advised that they should not continue to the further steps of the tool if they have identified no evidence of financial exploitation. And now I've talked enough. I'll turn things over to Karen, who will take us through the steps of the FEIST and explain the role of the forensic accountant. Karen, please take it away.
Thanks, Alan. Let me pull up my PowerPoint here. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So back in 2016, when Alan and his team reached out to me about creating a tool to help with financial exploitation cases, I had to really think about, what is there one tool that could do all the things that a forensic accountant would do? And it was actually a really fun project because the more that I thought about it, I had to kind of break up each phase of a financial exploitation investigation and turn it into a series of simple steps. And what we were able to come up with were 8 individual steps and then a standalone document that helped us determine when an APS caseworker should consider involving a forensic accountant. So together, these steps would help the Adult Protective Services worker compile this complete referral package to use, whether or not they're involving a forensic accountant, such as for guardianship. Hopefully if you put all of these 8 steps together and handed the case over to a court evaluator or to a law enforcement investigator, you could make an effective and efficient referral. So the first step I'll walk through shortly is the client data form, where essentially you would complete this form at intake of a certain case. Step 2, you would complete during assessment. You go out to the client and ask them a list of questions we'll go through shortly. Step 3 is an opportunity for you to step back and look at what the red flags are in the assessment period. And then step 4 is a place for you to document income and expenses that you're aware of for the client. Step 5 is an opportunity for you to document the individual accounts that you're aware of. Step 6 is a document review guide. In addition to the bank accounts that you're aware of, what are some other financial documents or even non-financial documents that might help you get through or to the root of a financial exploitation case? Step 7 is for the brave souls that want to do some math using Microsoft Excel. That will help you summarize the activity that you see on the bank statement. And finally, step 8 is an opportunity to step back and look at all the red flags we've identified in each of these steps. You can use one, you can use all, you can use none. They're not a required element for APS caseworkers in New York State. They're simply, like Alan said, a helpful tool. Trying to advance this here. Here we go. So step 1 is the client data form. And we developed the client data form to document the important demographic information that's typically captured in APS databases like ASAP and APSnet. But that a third party, whether it's the forensic accountant, the court evaluator, law enforcement, we don't have access to that database, but the information that's captured in there is helpful to our review of the case. And more importantly, the client data form contains a space for the caseworker to provide a narrative of the situation they're assessing in a form that makes them the most comfortable, so they can write out a few sentences. But basically the purpose is to summarize the client information in a clear and concise manner so that they can forward the case on. And I will pull that up right here so you can see it. The client data form can be completed electronically, or they can print this document out and fill it out in the field or at their desk. So it documents the agency, the worker, the email address for a third party to contact the caseworker who has the information on this case. You can record whether others live in the home, who the POA is and their relationship, who the healthcare proxy is and their relationship, and of the people that live in the home, what is their relationship. Referral date is a drop-down calendar. Referral source, a drop-down menu. This is, of course, if you're completing it electronically. You can fill in their date of birth and other demographic information. And as I talked about previously, the case summary piece is where you can enter various sentences about, what really happened. And what we want to know when we get a case, a step one, is what is the primary concern? Is it that they're a victim of scams? Is it that the home health care aide has been taking money? There isn't a drop-down menu that can capture all that info, so we allow it to be a narrative component. So that's step one. Step two is the client questions form. It's a list of questions that ask the client, and it provides a structure for documenting the client's answers to these questions. So for each question, as the caseworker goes through, they can indicate yes, no, or unknown, because oftentimes we know that the client may be unwilling to answer, or in many cases, unable, and that's okay. But at least a caseworker who may not ever have had experience with a financial exploitation case before can comfortably go out to a client and ask the right questions. With the first draft of the tool, we received some feedback that the question list was too long. Some caseworkers were going out and they were saying, we're sitting down and we're asking all these 44 questions, and many of them aren't applicable in certain cases. So when we went back to the focus group, we revised and reordered the questions so that if no red flags were presented in the first set of questions, I think it's like 1 through 23, I'll show you in a minute, the worker need not continue with the FEIST. And step two looks like this. So again, you can document the agency, whatever APS agency, the worker, the case number, and the date it was referred. So the initial client questions, 1 through 24, are kind of high level, what's going on here. And we also left space for caseware observations, because we know when you go out and visit with a client, it's not just what the client is telling you, it's what you're observing while you're out there. So, are there collection invoices lying around? Are the utilities disconnected? Unopened mail, lack of food, all of those things that you're familiar with seeing. Step two is a place for you to document those. Now, the initial questions are things like, does anyone else live with you? Does that person contribute to household expenses? And then depending on the response, we have this other column called description, which is the caseworker space to document their answer and prompt them to a next step further on in the tool. So for example, the question number 5, does anyone else live with you? If yes, you would make sure that you documented that on case 1, because anyone who's reviewing this case later on is going to want to know, who is living with the client. Do you have regular income? Question 8 here. How much and from what sources? Step 4, we'll see shortly, is the step where you document all of that. So halfway through the tool, after you get through questions 1 through 24, you come to this decision point, right? So if there are no indicators of financial exploitation, you can stop the use of the tool. However, if you answered yes to some of the above, or no, as the case may be, and there are indicators of financial exploitation, you can use questions 25 to 44 to really dig deeper into what's going on. So have you had to go to the hospital recently? This is an important question because if we get the financial records back, the bank statements, and we're seeing ATM withdrawals during the period we know the victim was in the hospital, we want to make sure we have note of that. So this is a place for you to document this. Regular expenses, summarize them in step 4. What kind of spending should we be seeing when we go through these records? What's the use of the car? Beneficiaries, is there a will? These are all standard questions I'm sure you ask all the time, but here they are in a place where you can document the answers in one location. And again, we have room for documenting your observations. Is there isolation? Did they make poor eye contact? Are they withdrawn, malnourished, etc.? What about the individuals that are managing the finances? What are your observations about them? And then finally, if you complete this document electronically, All the cells will expand as you type into them. So don't worry about trying to fit them into these 3 pages, they'll expand. But if you are filling it out in the field, you can write on the back, print multiple copies, whatever you need to do, whatever makes you most comfortable. But there is room at the bottom for any other comments or observations that you want to make that we didn't specifically ask about in step 2. And we have space at the end for questions if you have questions about any of these steps as I go through them. One big thing we made sure when we went out and trained on the use of this tool is that don't expect to go in there with your clipboard and be able to ask the client all of these questions. We want to make sure that we build rapport with the client, because talking about finances is a really touchy thing, and we recognize that. So don't feel like every question has to be asked. See which questions are the most relevant for you and go from there. So step 3. Step 3 gives the caseworker an opportunity to step back, like I said, and assess all of the red flags that presented themselves during intake and assessment. It also contains a decision point that asks 4 key questions. That is there a reason to believe the client may be a victim of financial exploitation by the hands of another person? Is this something that you cannot rule out? Is there a reason to believe someone may be taking the client's funds or property without the client's permission or knowledge? Is there a reason to believe that someone is using the client's funds or property in their own interest rather than the interest of the client? And does the client indicate he or she is being exploited and this cannot be ruled out? If you can answer yes to any of these questions, you're going to want to continue use of the FEIST and dig deeper. But if you answer no, it's unlikely that financial exploitation is going on and you can close your investigation. Step 3 looks like this. Again, you can document the agency, the worker, case number, etc. Here's the checklist for the red flags. In your client questions, if you use them appropriately, you're going to observe that this individual relies on others for their ADLs or IADLs, as the case may be. They're isolated. Perhaps they feel threatened or ashamed. And when you can go down this list and check off these boxes and you realize that all of these factors exist together, that's a huge problem. Maybe individually, you're not making a convincing case that financial exploitation is occurring. But if someone can look at this and see that all of these factors exist, they're going to be more concerned. And there's even space for you to reference the specific indicators in step 2. So for example, if I want to document someone's isolated from their resources or other contacts, I would say see step 2. Because in step 2, when I sat down with the client, I documented my concerns there. And then, of course, there's space to make other comments. And here's the decision point where we ask the 4 questions I referred to earlier. So if the answer to any of these is yes, you proceed with the use of the FEIST and take other needed action to gather the additional information. And that additional action is making a prompt request for their financial records wherever the client is believed to have an account, and you would use the standard request form approved by your local district. And of course, NAFSA puts this out, and this is the request form that you should be using. Makes specific reference to Gramm-Leach-Bliley, and it details, in addition to the bank statement, what other records you'd like to request. And I'll talk about those a little bit in a moment. You also want to know, where the client is believed to have given a power of attorney to an agent, and then send that agent a 15-day letter directing the agent to provide the POA document and all other written transactions made by the agent on behalf of the client. And our template in New York State for the APF letter is this. So it says, this county Department of Social Services requests a record of all receipts, disbursements, etc. If they don't return the accounting, then APF can initiate a special proceeding to revoke that power of attorney. But just trying to get the 15-day letter and the documentation makes it really easy for the investigator to compare the activity that they are seeing in the bank records when they come back to what the agent has said that they spent. And oftentimes, as you can imagine, it never matches. But that's a great thing for me as a forensic accountant to put in a report to make the argument that this individual isn't fit to be the agent for the client. So finally, the form says, if on the other hand, it appears that the client is giving their funds or property away with their consent or without coercion or intimidation, then it is unlikely to be financial exploitation. So if you can rule out financial exploitation, stop using the FEIST. This was something that this decision point came out of our second iteration of the FEIST, because the caseworkers were going out and they were using the FEIST from step 1 to step 8 in some cases where financial exploitation wasn't going on, and they were saying, hey, this is really onerous. We didn't need to do this whole thing because at the onset we knew it wasn't going on. Inserting this decision point helps limit the work when it's not appropriate. So step 4 is a place where the APS worker can document the client's income and expenses. So for each income source, there's space on the form where you can indicate the amount of each payment and the frequency. You know, is Social Security deposited monthly? Maybe there are some dividends that come quarterly, an annuity payment that comes annually. You can document that there. And then for each regular expense, you can list the type, who it's paid to, and the amount, and of course the frequency. Step 4 looks like this. We list as many income sources as we could think of, the most common ones that we see when we review these cases, and left space for others. You can indicate the amount and the frequency and make any notes. So for example, if you know that, in 2016, the client opened a new account and redirected their Social Security there, or a rep payee was appointed, you could document that there. Likewise with expenses. These were the most common expenses that we could think of, that we see all the time when we do these cases. And we left some room for others. And ultimately, when you look at, if you add up the amount of the income and you add up the expenses, assuming the same frequency, you come to this question, based on what you've listed above, does income appear to cover regular expenses? Yes or no? If it does, you're going to expect the balance of the account when you get the account statements back to either stay the same or rise. Of course, if it doesn't, you're going to expect to see a decline. And, in accounting, in traditional audit, we go in with a set of expectations and we take a look at the financial records and say, did the activity match our expectations? And where there's a mismatch, we dive deeper. And that's kind of the approach here. Is we're creating these expectations about what we're going to see in an individual's financial records to what we actually see. And hopefully that shows us some red flags. And again, there's space for other comments. If there's something that we didn't capture here that you want to make note of, there's space. So that is step 4. Step 5 is the client account log. And I really like step 5 because it kind of acts like a table of contents. When you send out all these requests for records to the financial institutions, you get piles of statements back, and you need a way to kind of keep them organized. And the client account log is a great way to do that, and then pass it off to whomever you're referring the case to. So it assists workers with creating a list of accounts that the client holds, whether they're asset accounts or debt accounts. And then tracking the documents, when they requested them, when they received them. Are these documents still outstanding? I sent this request letter 60 days ago and I still haven't gotten anything. So the information captured in step 5 includes the name of the bank. There's space to indicate the account type, checking, savings, CD, credit card, etc. And then the account number. Ownership information you can document there if you know it. There's space that shows, when an account was opened or closed if you know it. And then space to indicate what time period that you requested when you sent the bank request. And then you can indicate whether or not those documents have been received. Step 5 looks like this. You can list all their checking accounts there, financial institution account number, ownership, etc. And then document whether or not you received them. You can do the same for savings accounts or money market accounts, any CDs they might have out there. Investment accounts, there's a place to document them. Real property or other assets. And in addition to being a place where you can document all this information, it's also a prompt to get you to ask about these accounts. Maybe you didn't think beyond the checking or the savings account, and this prompts you to say, are there investment accounts out there? And should we be requesting them? And then, of course, there are places for loans, credit, and other debt, because that's information we're going to want to review in a financial exploitation case. Again, any questions on these, save them until the end, and we'll be happy to answer them. So what's a request from financial institutions? The standard APS request document that I showed you earlier from NASA captures all these individual elements. And it's important that you use the APS agency letterhead. You know this. Monthly statements are important, but they're not the whole picture. So for example, we can see that on March 3rd of 2018, a $400 check was written, but it just says, check $2,900 for $400. It doesn't say where. We need to request a copy of the canceled check to support that. We want to see account opening and change documents. Account opening documents are important because they can show you who owns the account, what beneficiaries are added, whether they were changed during the period you were looking at. And they also provide a really good sample of a client's signature. Now, of course, you and I cannot testify on handwriting, but we can certainly produce that in a court hearing and say, here's the client's signature. Here's the signature on a check. It just looks weird. Deposit items are equally important. When we are talking about a financial exploitation case, we spend a lot of time focusing on how funds were spent. But we also need to take an equal look at what funds came in and where they came from. So for example, there was a case here in New York that I used as an example all the time. There was a woman who had a ton of properties in the Finger Lakes region. That's wine country here in New York. And all her properties were on a lake. She couldn't get there anymore. So she hired this handyman to kind of watch over her properties for them. Well, while the handyman was involved, art started walking away and jewelry started walking away. And we got the bank records. We started going through them, and I saw this $47,000 deposit on the bank statements. So we went back and we requested the deposit item. And for this $47,000 deposit transaction, there was it was a check from an insurance company, and the little tiny memo line said, for lost jewelry claim. So this guy had taken jewelry worth $47,000 from this woman, helped her file an insurance claim for it, deposited the proceeds, and of course went and spent that money too. So, if we didn't ask for deposit items, we wouldn't have known that. So that was an important finding, ultimately, when we took the case for guardianship in criminal prosecution. Withdrawal slips are important. We want to know who signed for the withdrawal. So we'll look at signatures there. Copies of canceled checks I mentioned. Very important to see, of course, where these funds were paid. But they also contain important details on the memo line. And if it was a check written to cash, we want to look at the back of the check and see who of that check to cash. Teller notes and transfer details that show the origin and destination of wire transfers in and out. Any power of attorney documents on record. Does the POA that the bank holds match the one that the client holds or the perpetrator holds? Bank checks. Any copies of certified checks that went out, we want to see. Those aren't automatically produced when you submit a request for a record. And then any debt accounts associated with the client's name, like mortgages or credit cards. We get a lot of pushback, APS does, as you know, from banks when we go out and ask for the client's records. So what I've done is asked a lot of them to, not just use the national approved letterhead that references the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, but to insert a copy of this slide too that shows the exact language, that as a authorized government agency, APS can request those records. and the bank is obliged to turn them over. Requesting credit information, as you know, is a little different. So when we went out and we did our training, we made sure that caseworkers knew you can't request credit card statements the same way you can request bank statements, because you need the client's consent. But if you have consent, here are the places you can go to request those. Step 6 is a document review guide. Obviously, it takes some time for the bank statements to come back. So while you're waiting for them, there are other documents the client may have on hand that you might want to poke through and look at. So step 6 lists those documents, and it also provides some consideration for review. We're not just saying, here, go request this document. We're saying request this document and then look for these individual elements that might be relevant. And the purpose of that is to really just assist workers in reviewing the records, because, as Alan said, you know, you're not accountants and you're not expected to be, but we're going to help you, you know, get this baseline education through the use of the FEIST tool, and then hopefully narrow down what documents are important. So here is step 6, the document review guide. So the first document, for example, is power of attorney. In considerations for review, of course, we want to know, when was it executed? Did the client have capacity at that time? You know, who was authorized as agent? What are the powers? In New York, we have the statutory gift rider, which basically allows the agent to make gifts to anyone and everyone, including themselves. We want to know if the statutory gift rider was signed or initialed on the form. So if you were a new caseworker and you never saw a POA document before, this document review guide is going to walk you through what you should be looking for when you get your hands on it. Other documents do the same thing: healthcare property, wills, deeds, reverse mortgage documentation, HUD statements, lease agreements. I mean, we sent this list through our advisory committee, you know, and they added all the things that they could think of too. Hospital records, same thing. You know, when were they hospitalized? We shouldn't be seeing transactions then, you know, and what were they hospitalized for? Are there any documents, you know, doctor's notes about their capacity at that time? And then, of course, space for any other documents you might have reviewed or notes about them that you wanted to make. So that is step 6. Step 7 is the bank statement summary. And when I originally put this tool together as an accountant, of course, I had everything in Excel because that's, I live in there. But I got pushback from the group saying, you know what, we have a lot of people who aren't educated in Excel, don't have the experience, and this is going to intimidate them if we put this out. So we converted all the rest of the steps to Word documents, but we kept step 7 as an Excel document because it requires math, and Excel is an application that can do the math for you, and we wanted to make it as easy as possible. So this assists the caseworkers in performing an initial analysis of the in and out activity in a client's account. And it's completed electronically. Like I said, everything can be entered in as you see it on the face of the statement, and the ending balances, totals, etc. will just automatically calculate. However, if you complete it as a hard copy, you're going to have to do the math yourself. But either way, you'll get there. And then if the observed deposit or withdrawal patterns deviate from what you know you should see based on step 4, then you might want to do a more detailed review of bank statements. But this lets you figure out whether or not you need to do that. So here is step 7. You can type in the beginning balance in the account. You can record the income. Now you can see the ending balance is already calculating over here. So you know the individual gets Social Security income of $1,300. Their normal expenses they pay by check, they're $800 bucks. They don't use an ATM card that you're aware of, no fees, etc. suspected perpetrator gets involved, and all of a sudden you're seeing ATM withdrawals. So you're going to be able to tie out these ending balances to the statements, and that way you know you've captured everything. But if you go on, you can see if you complete this, you're going to start to see patterns emerge. And then at the end, it calculates how much income was deposited, how much money was spent in the different types of withdrawals, and ultimately what was the net activity in the account. Did they overspend, or did the account grow? So that is the bank statement summary for anyone who's brave enough to try Excel. When you're performing a detailed review of bank statements, our caseworkers, we can use step 8, which I'll show you in a minute, to look for suspect transactions. But we want to make sure, in our training, we said focus on patterns. What were the patterns before a suspected perpetrator got involved, and what are they now? This goes for deposits, this goes for withdrawals, this goes for account fees. Because even an increase in account fees might be an indication of mismanagement. And if, look at public records. Do they indicate the transfer, sale, or purchases of property? And if a mortgage was paid off, or if a house was sold, look for those proceeds or withdrawals in the bank accounts. If you don't see them during the month that the public records show they occurred, where's that money? And we also want them to look at non-financial information on the face of the statement, like change of ownership, change of power of attorney, change of address. As you flip through month to month, look at the names on the accounts, look at the addresses, where are these going? And also, whether or not the client enrolls in electronic statements. Is this something the client would have done? So step 8 is an opportunity to kind of assemble all of the red flags that you see when you go through and do your detailed statement review. You can reference the specific indicator of financial exploitation. So for example, if it's in the October 2017 statement, page 2, you can write that down. And when you submit step 8 as part of this complete referral package, a third party can just flip to step 8, see all the red flags that you saw with the different references to the single piece of evidence. That's really helpful. So step 8 looks like this. And imagine you're somebody reviewing this case, whether it's an APS supervisor, it's law enforcement. Your caseworker has checked off, listen, I see negative net activity in the account. I see increasing withdrawals. I see these large unknown withdrawals. Accounts are being consolidated. Utilities are being paid, but this person is in a facility. Round dollar amounts paid to credit card companies. That's usually indicative of outstanding debt. And you're indicating on what page of the documents it is, the investigation is done for them, and they might be more willing to pick up the case and fight it. So step 8 is a really great tool for a detailed review of bank statements, whether or not you use a forensic accountant or not. And then, of course, there's space for other comments. But the most important piece of evidence, and if you're able to put in here where you see that, we want to demonstrate a change in banking activity that's observed once the suspect became involved. That's what we're looking for, right? So that is step 8. So if you take all of the steps you completed, or just the few that you needed, this suite of tools basically is a detailed framework for gathering the records, conducting the investigation, and then ultimately handing them over in an organized way to someone who's going to assist you with the investigation and intervention in this case. So to make a referral, compile all your completed forms, steps 1 through 8, slide in all the statements and supporting records with your notes on them, include any other parties that are involved so the investigator knows they can reach out to this individual for questions if they have them. And then any other relevant documents you might have collected using step 6. And of course, when you do make a referral, especially if you're making a referral to the forensic accountant, let us know any deadline that's associated with the proposed intervention. If this is a case that's going for guardianship, I want to know when the next hearing is, so I make sure I produce a report in time for that. So we create created a standalone form of when and how to refer a case to a forensic accountant because in the beginning, when we started using a forensic accountant in New York, caseworkers and others on the EMDT, which I'll talk about in a minute, the multidisciplinary teams kind of didn't know, what case characteristics merit our involvement, and which don't. So we compiled this list to kind of help caseworkers figure that out. Generally, we get involved when a case is urgent and caseloads are too high for someone to perform a thorough analysis of 5 years of records. Complex account structure. They've got checking accounts, savings accounts, investment accounts, and in the investment accounts, the caseworkers look at them and are like, huh? We'll go through them and trace the money back and forth. If the duration of abuse is a long time, if you've got 7 years of records, that's how long it's been going on, or you don't necessarily know when the individual got involved, we can go through the records and try to pick that out based on the patterns we see. If there's commingling of funds and you're not really sure, which spending was on behalf of the client and which spending was on behalf of the power of attorney, we'll go through, look at patterns, and help figure that out. If there's unknown spending habits, you go into the client with step 4, but they can't tell you what their expenses are. We can go through and look at patterns and try to pick that out. If multiple perpetrators are suspected, same thing. Whose spending is whose. If guardianship is desired, that's really important because sometimes guardianship proceedings are a lot more effective when a CPA goes in there and says, here's what happened, they're being financially exploited or their money's being mismanaged, than a caseworker with a pile of financial records. If law enforcement involvement is desired, sometimes, a forensic accountant's report is huge to get that going. But most importantly, we've done reports when a client or their family can sit down, read the report, and understand what happened. And in a lot of cases, APS will be investigating and, we'll see that they're paying their nephew $100 here and there. And the client says, yes, I give them permission, $100 here and there. I've always done that. Well, did the client know that $100 here and there was $30,000 over the last year? If we're able to put that into a plain English report, that might change the client's mind about taking the appropriate next steps in a case to protect their assets. So that's a really important reason for us to get involved, is just to put what happened into plain English so that the client can acknowledge it and move forward. In New York, the individuals who have a role in a financial exploitation case are all of the individuals here, and certainly in your communities, hopefully you have these resources as well. And we're lucky in New York because, yes, we have MDTs, but they have been enhanced with the participation of a forensic accountant and a geriatric psychiatrist. So all of these individuals sit around the table and triage elder abuse cases. And in this EMDT program started in 2012 under a grant, and they have now been funded so that we will have an EMDT in every single county in New York by 2020. And those EMDTs will provide access to geriatric psychiatrists and to forensic accountants for financial exploitation cases. So that's really exciting. So you would use a forensic accountant to efficiently review hundreds of documents, and summarize the important facts of the case. All those case characteristics we talked about, that's probably a case you want a forensic accountant involved in. One of the benefits is that our report is independent of the client. Ethics prevents us from making an opinion on guilt or innocence. We can't say so-and-so is guilty of financial exploitation or whatever the charge is. We can only state the facts, but we can word the facts in such a way that a reasonable reader or a jury would come to the conclusion that we want them to come to. It's also really important to get us involved because things aren't always what they seem. Maybe we can find other accounts, we can find other perpetrators, other motives, or maybe we can figure out that financial exploitation really isn't going on. In one of our cases, we had a woman who had 2 trailers. One was the one that she lived in, and another was one that her late husband had maintained as his camp. Well, her nephew kind of moved in after the husband passed away and started running this car repair shop out of the second trailer, but he wasn't paying the mortgage on it or anything like this. So when APS got the call about this situation, they went out and it appeared that this woman was being financially exploited. We got the records back, but what we found out was that the nephew was actually depositing his income from the car repair service to the client's account, and if not for him, she wouldn't have been able to keep the trailer. Now, the nephew was the power of attorney, so the commingling of funds was an issue, but APS was able to go in and say, listen, here's what should happen. You should have 2 separate accounts that keep the 2 separate trailers, pay your own expenses, and everything was fine. So it wasn't financial exploitation like it originally looked like, and we were able to help the client maintain this trailer that meant so much to her. So for those of you who don't know, a forensic accountant is really someone who puts together numbers-based evidence to support legal action. But we're not always involved in litigation services. A lot of the things we do would be filed under, quote unquote, non-traditional services. So we could do business valuations, divorces, bankruptcies, if a business dissolves, fraud investigations, anything that you need to put a number on or value, that's typically what forensic accountants do. We also do different types of internal auditing, compliance audits, and then general business consulting. But what we're talking about here today is really our role in elder financial exploitation cases. When we did our work up in New York with the EMDTs starting in 2012, we piloted the use of 2 types of forensic accountants. We used public or law enforcement-based forensic accountants, and that was mainly in downstate in New York City, because the law enforcement agencies down there, due to proximity to Wall Street, had white-collar crime specialists on the staff of NYPD and the New York DA's office. However, in upstate New York and every other county, we didn't have the resources for that. So we had to use a private or community-based forensic accountant. But what we found was, in New York, if we used a DA or public law enforcement-based forensic accountant, they could only work on cases that were active criminal matters. Well, how many of these cases got to being an active criminal case? You needed a forensic accountant to come in before then, so that law enforcement would pick the case up. And so that was the role of the community-based forensic accountant. And not only were we able to provide evidence to law enforcement so they would get interested, we could also work on guardianship cases, which more often was where these cases went. So the difference, when you're thinking about involving a forensic accountant in your different APS districts, give some thought to whether you want someone who only works on the law enforcement side or whether you want someone who can be a little bit more flexible. So why it matters, we gather enough evidence to get law enforcement involved in the first place. A community-based forensic accountant can support guardianship petition, and really, we can help the victim understand what really happened. Our role with APS has been to consult. We take calls all the time from a caseworker or supervisor in a field that's like, hey, this is the situation. I don't know where to go next. I don't know what documents to request. What should we do? We answer the question. It takes 2 minutes, and it's done. We might do a full-fledged review of financial records. We'll issue a concise report based on what we see in those records, and then ultimately, if required, we'll provide expert witness testimony or fact witness testimony in court. Our reports generally contain a brief objective and scope. We got involved because we wanted to support, we're supporting this APS investigation. Here's all the accounts that we looked at. We'll put the background section in there, which are the facts or assumptions that form the basis of our investigation. Findings, of course, a conclusion, how much money could we attribute to the victim, how much money could we attribute to the suspect, and then how much was unaccounted for. And ultimately, that written report is supported by appendices or financial exhibits like this one that show money in, money out, and some various calculations that we made to determine whether expenses were reasonable or not. We'll throw in some illustrative exhibits as well, whether we create them, graphs like this that show a change in pattern after a suspect got involved. Sometimes we don't need to create them. We can pull them right from the financial records we review. In the case on the left, this is an investment account balance graph, and the graph on the right is a credit score graph, which you can see plummeted after a suspected perpetrator got involved. All of those are convincing visual pieces of evidence that are helpful in a case. So our reports can be used for guardianship and criminal prosecution, like we talked about. What's really great about the multidisciplinary teams is we're able to come up with a lot of creative ways to remove a perpetrator if a client refuses to file charges. We can take a forensic accountant's report and drop it off at the IRS office or at the public benefits office and to show that this individual received X dollars, but I'll bet you they didn't claim it. So that's been really helpful. And then sometimes contractor fraud and other types of scams, we put reports together for those as well. So I'll give you a case example before we open it up to questions about how the FEIST worked in a case. APS got a case referred to them from an investment brokerage because they noticed large checks were being written from this woman's cash account to her 2 adult children, both of whom at various points were POA. And though the signatures were in the client's name, they appeared forged. So at assessment, APS found that Ms. X had severe cognitive impairments, and her 2 children sat in on the interview and did most of the talking for her. It came out that the 2 adult children had been trading POA authority for years because, it was only fair that, Jane got mom for a year and could write herself all the checks in the world, and then John got it the following year so he could get money from mom as well. And that's how they perpetrated this. So the teller at the local bank kind of corroborated this story. Yep, the 2 adult children, they come in here with the very confused mom and do all the talking for her. So the caseworker started using the FEIST tool, and in the process of looking at the step 2 questions, they found that the client did have some awareness that the forgeries were occurring, and she was uncomfortable with it. And come to find out, her power had been shut off that summer, and she was on a payment plan with the utility company. When they used step 4, they found some delinquent taxes and a cable bill. Step 5 found that the bank accounts had previously been closed due to fraud. Step 6 found a car in the client's name that she was unable to drive. And ultimately, the forensic accounting, once referred, found out by the 2 adult children. And then using the FEIST and the forensic accountant's report, the guardianship petition, and criminal charges were filed against the 2 children. So that was a really great success story that kind of involved both the guardianship and the criminal side. The caseworker completed all the FEIST steps, and I completed a report, and we got a good result for this client. So if you're interested in getting a forensic accountant involved in your cases, you'll want to check first, of course, that they are actually a CPA and not just holding themselves out to be. CPAs, if you end up requiring someone to stand up in court, the CPA designation is very important for establishing credibility. You can go to cpaverify.org and check out someone's credentials there. Not all state jurisdictions report to this website, but most of them do. You can contact your state society of CPAs and ask them, who are they aware does forensic accounting in the state. The Association of International Certified Public Accountants, the AICPA. I've got a link there. You can find a CPA. Again, I don't know how they gather their information from state boards or whatnot, but you can filter on CPAs that have a certified in financial forensics designation. ACFE is a great place to find a CFE. That link is there. And if you don't have the funds to pay a CPA or CFE for this work, you might want to consider some retired law enforcement investigators who would be interested in volunteering their time, or even starting a student internship program, because that is how I started in this work, as a student intern. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alan for some closing comments.
Thank you, Karen. As we've said, the FEIST was developed to give APS and its investigative partners additional support when handling investigations of financial exploitation, and especially for those more complex cases with multiple accounts, multiple suspected perpetrators, investment accounts, perhaps issues of coerced property transactions as well. But even for simpler cases, it was designed to help, and even for simpler cases, and even if you don't have access to a forensic accountant, it was designed to help APS determine whether or not there's a reason to believe that financial exploitation is occurring or not. It's also has been helpful, as Karen has said, in cases where we have found not financial exploitation, but mismanagement of funds by the client or others. So in those cases, it helps APS to identify the mismanagement, and APS can seek to take steps to address mismanagement by informal or formal financial management if the client's agreeable, or to consider steps such as a rep payee or guardianship if the client's unable to manage funds due to impairment. FEIST and the investigatory steps also has helped APS in cases to reveal co-occurring abuse and neglect as well. And when that's identified, APS can take steps to address those as well. Just a bit of an update. We've expanded our original pilot sites, which was Onondaga and Queens. We've expanded our pilot sites during the grant to include Livingston and Monroe counties, as well as a New York City APS vendor, Jasser, for a Queens pilot. Under our grant, the field testing continues in our pilot sites, and the pilot sites continue to give us feedback. We'll soon be using this feedback to consider whether or not some additional tweaks to the tool should be made. Our ACL grant will be ending this fall, and in the coming months, we'll be providing training on the use of the FEIST to all APS units in New York State. We are fortunate in New York State that through a combination of state and federal funding, by the end of 2020, it's expected that every county within the state will have an enhanced multidisciplinary team with continuing access to forensic accounting firm, the Karen's firm, that's being used under our ACL grant program. I'm advised that as of this February, there are enhanced MDTs in 28 of New York's 62 counties, and by this time next year, it's expected that this will expand to 38 counties, and by the end of 2020, it's expected to expand to all counties. I want to just convey my heartfelt thank you to Karen Weber and her firm for its services and great work with APS and the nonprofit providers of services, the vulnerable adults, that she's been working with for the last several years. I also want to greatly thank the pilot APS sites for their pioneering use of the FEIST and for their valuable feedback to us that has helped revise the FEIST to make this more casework friendly. So thank you very much. And now, Tammy, I'll send it over to you to see if there are any questions that have come in.
Okay, we got a few questions here. See, the very first question that came through was, how does New York State define a vulnerable adult?
Well, New York State, the Adult Protective Services criteria are a person who's age 18 or older who, due to a physical or mental impairment, is unable to protect themselves from harm. whether it's financial exploitation, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect by others, and has no one else available who is willing and able to assist responsibly. That's our definition. That's in our statute and in our regulation.
Thank you. We did state that the PowerPoints were going to be on the website, NATSA website later. Someone's asking, will they be able to get a copy of the PowerPoints? Can they print them up?
Yes, they'll be able to do that. Yes, they'll be on the website, and they'll be able to print them off of the website,
Okay.
off of the NAPSA website. Yes.
Okay.
We're hoping that that'll be available in the next few weeks.
Okay. And we have a couple people wanted to know is how are they going to get copies of the forms to use? And would they have to purchase the FEIST tool?
No, we'll make those. We will be making those available. As I've mentioned, we are continually seeking the feedback of the pilot APS units. We may be making some additional tweaks, but we will be and we'll be talking to ACL as well. And then, but the plan is to make these forms available.
And just so everyone knows, our contact information is up there. I'm keeping a spreadsheet of everyone who requests the forms so that when they are available, I can email the link out. So if you want to get on that list, send me an email and I'll put you on it. My contact info should be on the screen.
Okay, thank you. Next question, is this grant through ACL? If so, which grant, and is it still available?
This was a grant that came in. This was a grant originally in 2015. This was the Enhancing APS Practice grant. And ACL has issued other rounds of APS enhancement of practice as well. So there have been additional rounds of this ACL grant. And so I'm not sure what ACL's future plans are to issue grants, but they seem to be doing this on a more regular basis, and we're delighted about that. I think it would probably be helpful for to check the ACL website, as well as the the NAPSA, become a NAPSA member, because NAPSA regularly lets NAPSA members know and distributes when ACL provides notice of these grant opportunities.
Okay, thank you. What happens if the bank does not provide the requested documentation when using the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act paperwork?
Okay. We have, since using the standard protocols and the standard forms, which cite the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act as well as the New York State statute that permits APS to conduct these financial exploitation investigations, we have gotten every year a better rate of positive response. What we have also done is sometimes we have been notified by APS that a particular bank is, balking at providing that information, and we have done a variety of things to follow up. In some cases, I've sent letters to the banks or the bank counsel. In other cases, we've been contacting our New York State Department of Financial Services. What we do in New York is, beyond sending the form, I have requested APS to send me, as director of APS, regular reports, so they can advise me what requests have been made of what banks and what branches of what banks, and whether they have provided the information or not. And if not, why not, if they provided an explanation. In some cases, it's reaching the right person within the organization. There have been some cases where even after attempts to convey to them that the Gramm-Leach-Wiley Act says, and the federal regulators have all said, and in New York, the state regulators have said that banks and other financial institutions are authorized to provide this information to APS. Some financial institutions, a few, have still continued to balk, and in some cases, APS, working with their counsel's office, have been able to get that information through subpoena. In other cases, working with the DA's office, if there are SARS, suspicious activity reports, and it's a law enforcement case, the DA is able to access that information as well.
Thank you. Is the 15-day letter available in California? If so, how does someone obtain it?
Okay, the 15-day letter is available in New York State because New York State's general obligation law, which governs powers of attorneys, authorizes it. I have spoken in the past with some counsel in California about this law, and there was interest about looking at that and considering whether in California whether efforts could be made to pass that law as well. If anyone's interested, you have my contact information. I'm happy to send you the New York State law as a possible model for consideration in other states.
Okay, thank you. This question here, you did answer that the tools and materials will be available for other states, and you did give your information, contact information for that. So part of this question is just more of a statement, just saying it's an excellent presentation, very useful information for our APS staff.
Thank you.
Do all adults 18 and over who are 5150 meet APS criteria?
Do all adults 18 or older who are, what was the rest of that?
5150 meet APS criteria, which I think that's legal.
I'm not sure what 5150 means, okay? But not, and I know in some states, you know, you can be eligible for APS by virtue of your age. Not so in New York State. Whether you're 18 or whether you're 118, there has to be impairment facing harm, and no one else to assist responsibly. Those are the criteria that we're looking for in New York State.
Okay, thank you. I think 5150 is a term we call 1,000 when they're taken to the hospital.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't familiar with that term. Yeah.
Okay. Let me see here. I think you answered this one, but it's there's a lot of pushback and even refusal from banks to provide financial information during an investigation. This occurs even with the release of information. What leverage do we have to complete our investigations?
Well, I mean, we've tried this in New York. We've tried to communicate with the financial industry in many ways. In New York, we worked out and collaborated with the New York Bankers Association and with the Credit Union Association of New York State, and developed in tandem with them best practice guides for their respective memberships to encourage, in terms of red flags, identification of elder financial abuse, and encouraging reporting, letting them know that at least in New York State, and I hope it's the case in your state, that if you make a good faith referral to APS or testify about it, you've got civil immunity. And there's confidentiality, APS confidentiality. So there's that. It's also very important to have as a partner your state regulator of financial institutions and or of securities, to have them working with you as partners in terms of and for them to make the presentation to their regulated entities is really important. And to be able to, and a lot of people still don't know about the federal regulatory guidance that came out in 2013, about Graham-Leach-Bliley and the exceptions to the bank customer privacy law that authorize. So that's and sometimes you have to reach people on a personal level and talk to them in the financial institutions. And do you know anyone of financial exploitation? And you go in a room and ask, how many of you know somebody who's been a victim of financial exploitation? You'll see a lot of hands go up. And maybe, that plus the law and the heart can get you there. But the partnership, what we've done with the reporting that we've done, we have, and it's not an adversarial relationship with the financial institutions. We're trying to work together. We're trying to say we have a common mission. We have to protect vulnerable customers, whether they're elderly or whether they're young and disabled. And let's see what we can do to give credit to those financial institutions that are working and to assist vulnerable adults and to protect their funds.
Okay. Thank you. And person did respond with that definition for the 5150, saying a 3-day hold, mental health related for gravely disabled.
Yep.
Thank you for giving us that definition. Again, we have a couple more minutes here, so I just want to remind everyone, though, the PowerPoint presentation used today will be available on the NAPSA website soon. And this webinar was also recorded and will be made available on NAPSA website also in the next few weeks. I want to thank Alan and Karen for an excellent presentation, and thank everyone for their questions and for calling in today. And Alan, Karen, do you have any last words?
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I hope this was helpful.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, everyone.